The rising cost of living in America is starting to take its toll on everyday citizens, as many are struggling to make ends meet. Inflation has caused a surge in rental prices, leaving people with less money to spend on basic necessities. Shelters across the country are seeing a surge in demand for their services, as individuals are finding it increasingly difficult to find affordable housing. The housing crisis in the United States has reached a critical point, with rents continuing to rise at an alarming rate. Recent data from Realtor.com has shown that only 6% of rental units are currently vacant in the country, making it even harder for people to find a place to call home. For many Americans, rising mortgage rates have made it impossible to enter the housing market, leading to a surge in demand for rentals. Even those with the lowest incomes are struggling to find affordable rent in most states, with eviction rates on the rise. With no measures in place to combat the crisis, observers are warning of a catastrophic situation. As the disparity between rent prices and wage growth continues to grow, millions of Americans are facing the possibility of eviction. It's time for action to be taken to address the housing crisis and help those who are struggling to make ends meet. The current situation is unsustainable, and urgent measures need to be put in place to prevent a further escalation of the crisis. Rent prices continue to skyrocket, leaving many Americans struggling to make ends meet. While the Bureau of Labor Statistics reports that middle-class men and women earn an average of $1,085 per week, this income is no match for the soaring cost of rent. With over 41% of their income going towards rent, there is little left for necessities such as food, utilities, and transportation. And for low-income workers, the situation is even bleaker. According to the National Housing Coalition, those earning lower wages must spend nearly 55% of their income on rent, making it impossible to save for the future or cover unexpected expenses. Even middle-income renters are reaching a breaking point, with a recent study by Harvard's Joint Center for Housing Studies revealing that they too are struggling to keep up with rising costs. As the rental market continues to surge, many would-be home buyers are staying put, further driving up demand and pricing out those who are most vulnerable. And for renters from communities of color and impoverished areas, the situation is especially dire. With 60% of those behind on housing payments coming from communities of color and 40% from low-income neighborhoods, the rental market is creating an ever-widening gap between the haves and have-nots. But perhaps most troubling of all is the fact that no state has enough housing for low-income renters. This means that millions of Americans are living on the edge of homelessness, with the homeless population increasing by 32% since 2015. While some new housing projects are being built, most are aimed at middle and upper-income households, leaving low-income renters with few options. And with an individual needing to earn $24.90 per hour to afford a rental, without spending more than 30% of their income, it's clear that the rental market apocalypse is far from over. Despite working hard and putting in long hours, my income barely covers my rent, transportation, food, and utilities. In fact, I earn just a fraction of what the average middle-class income was in 2022, which was $70,784. Renters across the nation are struggling to make ends meet, with nearly 15% still unable to pay their rent according to recent data. The pandemic has only exacerbated the problem, and while federal rental aid programs were implemented, many major players in the rental market chose to ignore the eviction moratorium and engage in shady eviction practices. I'm not alone in this struggle. Nearly a third of the American workforce earns less than $18 per hour, and these wealth gaps have remained unchanged for decades. It's become the norm for families to rely on two incomes just to make ends meet. In some areas, minimum wage earners have no choice but to take on multiple jobs just to afford rent. According to Zillow, in 2022, there was literally no place in the US where a minimum wage earner could afford a typical two-bedroom rental of $1,940 per month. I've done the math, and it's disheartening to see that I would have to work 129 hours a week just to afford a two-bedroom rental on my current wage. That's almost 5.5 days of continuous work with no time for rest or leisure. And even then, I'd barely be able to cover my other expenses. It's no wonder that so many low-income earners struggle to make ends meet. But finally, there seems to be some hope on the horizon. The Biden administration is planning to launch a Renters' Bill of Rights to address this housing crisis. This Bill of Rights would give agencies like the Federal Trade Commission the power to investigate unfair rental practices and ensure that renters have safe, affordable, and fair housing. For over 44 million rental households in the US, this could be the change we've been waiting for. I knew that some federal laws existed to protect renters, like the Fair Housing Act and the Americans with Disabilities Act, but they didn't seem to offer much help in my situation. There was no comprehensive set of laws for renters in the US, and the country's rental market depended on local laws and processes. I had heard about the Renters' Bill of Rights, but it was still in its early stages and couldn't be implemented just yet. And while the agency was requiring landlords to give a 30-day heads-up before evicting someone for not paying rent, the reality was that evictions weren't always so simple. Unlawful evictions were all too common, and some landlords even scared tenants with threats of eviction, making the rental market even tougher. It wasn't just me facing this nightmare. More and more people were facing evictions as eviction filings hit a 14-year high during the month of August. This increase came nearly a year after the moratorium on evictions ended, and it seemed that eviction rates had gone back to pre-pandemic levels. In some places, it was even worse due to inflation and ballooning rental costs. A coalition of hundreds of tenants, unions, and housing activists had called the situation a national emergency as rental costs rose at the fastest pace in 3 decades. It was as if the US was on the brink of a major eviction tsunami, if it wasn't already in the middle of it. I couldn't help but feel hopeless and overwhelmed. How could this be happening in a country that prided itself on freedom and opportunity? How could we let our most vulnerable citizens fall through the cracks like this? As I packed up my belongings and prepared to leave my apartment for the last time, I couldn't help but wonder what would happen next. Would I find another place to live? Would I be able to pay rent and keep a roof over my head? These were the questions that kept me up at night, and I knew that I wasn't alone in my worries. Premium Ventra, Invitation Homes, and the Siegel Group are just a few examples of companies that have filed over 14,000 eviction cases from March 2022 to July 2021, despite being financially stable and even receiving millions in Paycheck Protection Program funds. But why push renters away when business is doing so well? This question remains unanswered. For low-income renters, finding affordable housing is an even greater challenge, with many buildings established for such purposes. However, rent prices have soared, with new leases costing nearly twice as much as renewals. This can trap renters in less than ideal apartments, making it too expensive to move closer to work or school. Many renters find themselves in a tough financial spot as their leases go month to month and landlords renew at higher rates. This leads to a rise in evictions, as landlords are more likely to evict tenants when they can raise the rent for the next tenant. The connection between rental rates and eviction rates is clear, with a 1% increase in rent leading to a 2% increase in evictions. The situation has become so dire that an average of 14 renters are now competing for just one apartment, and illegal evictions are contributing to the ongoing homelessness crisis. The effects of this housing crisis are far-reaching and devastating for the nation's most vulnerable citizens. Many renters are at risk of financial instability and potential eviction, while the national rental vacancy rate is at an almost 40-year low of 5.6%. But it's not just renters who are suffering. Landlords are left to shoulder the responsibility of providing adequate housing for financially struggling renters. They too are facing the effects of the housing crisis, with a lack of government support and rising costs making it difficult for them to keep up with their own financial obligations. It's a complex issue that raises a lot of moral questions, but unless swift action is taken to address it, the U.S. may be known for being a hotbed of inequality, poor living conditions, and rampant homelessness. The current situation is grim, but it doesn't have to be permanent. With the right policies and support in place, the U.S. can eventually solve the housing crisis that's sweeping across the nation. As we contemplate the way forward, it's important to remember that this crisis is not just a matter of economics. It's a moral issue that affects us all. We must come together to find solutions that benefit everyone, from renters to landlords, and ensure that everyone has access to safe, affordable housing. Only then can we truly say that we are a nation that values the dignity and well-being of all its citizens. What are your thoughts on the housing crisis in America? Share your perspective in the comments section, and don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Together, we can make a difference and create a brighter future for all.